The candles in Ashbourne Hall had burned 3 hours already, and the night was only growing louder. Margaret Voss did not belong in the ballroom. She knew it the way she knew the weight of a laden tray, the angle at which a footman must hold his back to avoid being noticed, the cold stone of the servants' corridor at midnight. She belonged in the shadows at the room's edge, moving between clusters of silk and laughter with her eyes cast exactly low enough to register no one and to be registered by none. What she had not planned for was Lord Carver's elbow. He moved without warning, reaching back for his companion's shoulder, and the tray tilted. Margaret caught it for one suspended instant, her grip white at the knuckles, and then the larger decanter rolled free and the dark wine found its own course. And the course it found was the chest of Elliot Wren, Duke of Stanhaven. The room did not fall silent at once. It contracted the way a lung contracts before it can draw the next breath, and then it was silent in that particular ballroom way that is worse than noise. Because every person in it turned, and every person in it saw, and not one of them made a sound. She did not look up. She was already crouching, already reaching for the decanter that had rolled to a stop against his boot, her hands moving in the automatic competence of 4 years of service, her face trained to the stillness that meant nothing can hurt me if I do not show that it has hurt me. The wine had caught the white of his cravat and spread. She could see it from this angle, the dark bloom of it, and she wished very much that the floor would cooperate and receive her entirely. She reached for the decanter, her left hand pressed to the marble for balance, and that was when she heard him stop breathing. Not the crowd, him. A single arrest of sound above her, and then a quality of attention that she felt before she understood it, the way one feels a door open in a dark room before the candle shows the figure standing there. She looked up. The Duke of Stanhaven was not looking at the stain on his coat. He was looking at her hand. At her left hand, pressed flat to the marble, and on the third finger of that hand, a ring. The ring was silver, worked in a pattern too fine for a maid's wages and too deliberate for coincidence. And at its center, pressed small as a whispered word, was the crest of the Voss family, a house that had been one of the great houses of England, and was, as every person in this room knew, utterly extinct. She should have withdrawn her hand. She did not. If you have ever watched a man's face learn something it was not expecting to learn, you understand what happened in that fraction of a second. Stay, and you will understand what it cost them both. His eyes moved from the ring to her face, and what was in them was not what she had braced for. She had braced for contempt or amusement, or the particular performance of not having noticed that the well-bred use to spare everyone embarrassment. What was in them instead was a sharp and careful attention, the kind that a man deploys when he is attempting to make certain of something he is not, yet willing to name aloud. "Stand up," he said. His voice was low and level, and it carried no more than 2 feet, which meant only she and the nearest witnesses could hear him. "You will cut your hands on the glass." She stood. She held the decanter at her side, and she kept her left hand loose at her skirt, and she did not look at him again, because looking at him again would have required something she did not currently possess. "The poor creature," Lady Honoria Vane said from 3 feet away, in the particular musical tone that was not quite a whisper. "Stanhaven's coat will never recover. One wonders why they employ girls who cannot manage a tray." Margaret did not flinch. She had learned not to flinch at Honoria Vane's voice. The same week, she had learned the servant's route from the wine cellar to the East Gallery. She withdrew to the shadows. She did not see that the Duke of Stanhaven watched her go. She had come to Ashbourne Hall 6 months prior, in the cold middle of November, with a single bag and a letter of reference from a rector in a village, small enough that no one in London was likely to write to confirm it. Her name, as far as the Ashbourne housekeeper was concerned, was Margaret Voss. This was not a fiction. It was the only truth she had kept. Margaret Elspeth Voss, daughter of Charles Voss, second son of the late Earl of Voss, had not lied about her name. She had lied about everything surrounding it. She had been educated at her aunt's expense until the aunt died and the expense stopped. She had spent the 18 months between her aunt's death and her arrival at Ashbourne managing the remnants of what her father had, in the generous language of solicitors, left unsettled. What he had left was not a settled estate. What he had left was a ring, the title deeds to a property whose mortgages exceeded its value by £800, and the knowledge that she was, in the counting of the world, a girl with nothing. Service had been her own idea. She had not told anyone whose idea it was. The only person who might have cared was her mother's old friend, Mrs. Pemberton, who had been the one to find her the rector's letter and who had pressed Margaret's hand at parting and said, very quietly, "Keep the ring. Whatever happens, keep the ring. Your mother would have wanted you to have something that was hers." She had kept it. She had worn it on the third finger of her left hand because it fit there, and because she had reasoned that a maid's left hand was not a thing that anyone examined. She had not planned for a duke's attention. The morning after the dinner, she was in the East Gallery with a feather brush and a set of portraits that needed their upper frames cleared of dust. When she heard the gallery door open, she did not turn. The particular weight of a man's step on old oak flooring had become, over 4 years of service, a diagnostic tool, and she knew without turning that this was not one of the footmen, and not the butler, and not Lord Carver, who was a heavy man who led with his heel. "The gallery is being cleaned this morning, Your Grace," she said to the portrait of a long-dead Carver ancestor, a woman in a ruff who looked, Margaret had always privately thought, deeply unimpressed with everyone around her. "I will be finished within the hour, if you prefer to wait." "I do not prefer to wait," said the Duke of Stanhaven. She turned. He was standing at the far end of the gallery, still as a man who has learned that stillness is a form of command, his coat a dark, severe cut against the morning light that came in low and gray from the north windows. He was holding something. She registered this before she registered what it was, and when she did register what it was, her heart did something inconvenient in her chest. He was holding a small book. The spine was green. She knew that spine. She had not known that the library's morning room contained a volume of her father's correspondence. But she supposed, now that she was looking at the evidence, that she should not have been surprised. Her father had corresponded with many people. There was a Charles Voss, the Duke said, without inflection. He died 4 years ago. He had a daughter. Many men named Voss have daughters, Your Grace. The crest on your ring is a Voss crest. The one I am familiar with belongs to the earldom. Your father was a second son, which would explain the absence of the coronet, but not the ring itself. She had the feather brush still in her hand. She was aware of how she must look. In her gray dress with her hair pinned back under the maid's cap, holding a feather brush, being anatomized by a man who could remove her from this house with a single word to the housekeeper. She was also aware, with the part of her that was still her father's daughter, and not yet entirely exhausted by the effort of not being so, that she was not going to lie to him. "My mother was a Voss before she married," she said. "She gave the ring to me before she died. I wear it because it was hers." He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched his jaw hold that particular set that she suspected meant he was deciding something. "What is your father's name?" It was not a question. "Charles Voss," she said. "Second son of the third Earl. He died 4 years ago, as you've zuabushed." Another silence. The light from the north windows was doing something cold and clarifying to the room, the kind of morning light that strips the comfortable assumptions from objects and people, and leaves only what is actually there. "You are educated," he said. "I read. Your diction is not a servant's diction." "Then I have not been careful enough." Something moved in his face. It was not amusement, quite, though it was in the vicinity of it. He closed the small green book and held it at his side and looked at her with that quality of attention she had felt in the ballroom. "Lady Vane has told Lady Carver that you are a clumsy provincial who should be dismissed," he said. "She used the phrase 'that sort of girl' twice in my hearing this morning." "That is Lady Vane's privilege." "It is," he said. "I did not say I agreed with her." He left before she could determine what he had meant by that. She stood in the cold gallery with the feather brush in her hand and the north light on her face and thought, with a conviction she could not entirely suppress, that she was going to need to be considerably more careful about her left hand. What she did not know yet was that the Duke of Stanhaven had, the previous evening, before he retired, written a single short letter to his solicitor in London. The house party at Ashbourne had gathered for a fortnight's shooting, and the usual seasonal rituals of introductions and strategic dining. There were 14 guests, which was enough for the Carver drawing-room to have its natural social weather, warm fronts and cold currents, and pressure systems of alliance and advantage. At the center of that weather, as she had been at the center of every such system for the past 3 seasons, was Lady Honoria Vane. Honoria was 26, a widow, in possession of a comfortable income, and an uncommon gift for reading a room. She had fixed her attention on the Duke of Stanhaven, with the focused patience of a woman who understood that the greatest prizes required the longest approaches, and she had arranged herself in his orbit with such practiced subtlety that most of the room had concluded the matter was, essentially settled. She was, in the language the season used for such determinations, the correct choice. She noticed him noticing the maid, she said, with a smile of perfect warm concern for the household's reputation. Poor Carver will have to replace the girl, I suppose. One cannot have clumsiness of that sort at a dinner of this size. These provincial hires so rarely manage the training, do they? She did not drop anything, said Miss Pertwee, the younger sister of the house's neighbor, who was 17 and had not yet learned to agree before thinking. Lord Carver knocked her. Carver is a guest, Honoria said pleasantly. The tray was her responsibility. Margaret was not at breakfast. Margaret was in the kitchen, cleaning the decanter that had rolled against a duke's boot, and learning from the scullery maid that Lady Vane had spoken to the housekeeper at 7 in the morning, and that the housekeeper had said she would look into it, which in the housekeeper's language meant she had not yet decided, and was waiting to see which way the wind went. The wind, that morning, went through the East Gallery in the form of a duke who asked questions he had no practical reason to ask. He found her again 2 days later. She had been sent to the library to retrieve a volume of maps that Lord Carver required for an argument about the Scottish border that he was, apparently determined to win with documentary evidence. She was on the upper step of the rolling ladder, her arm extended to the topmost shelf, when she heard the door below. She did not come down. The maps were on the top shelf, and she required the maps, and coming down from a ladder at the sound of a man entering a room was not something she was going to teach herself to do. The one at the far left, said the Duke of Stanhaven from somewhere directly below her. Carver has been arguing about Carlisle. The map he wants is the Parliamentary Survey of 1658. I am looking for it, she said. I know. I suggested he send for it specifically. She paused with her fingers on the spine of the wrong volume and allowed herself one small moment of deciding what to make of that. He had arranged to have her sent here. She filed this information where it needed to be filed, which was in the part of her that was paying attention to things she was not supposed to be paying attention to. She found the Parliamentary Survey. She came down the ladder. He was standing at the reading table, and she placed the volume on it and did not look at him, and then looked at him, because not looking was beginning to require more effort than looking. My solicitor has confirmed the debt on the Voss property in Derbyshire, he said, in the same tone one uses to report the weather. £840. The mortgage holder is a man named Grice, who has been extending the term in 18-month intervals for 4 years. The blood left her hand so completely that she felt the cold of the room in her palms. You had no right, she said. I had the right of any man with a solicitor and a general interest in facts. You had no cause. He looked at her steadily. I had a ring, and a woman who would not lie about her father's name, even when lying, would have been considerably safer. She looked at the Parliamentary Survey of 1658 and did not say anything. Outside the library windows, the November sky had gone the particular shade of pewter that meant rain before afternoon. Grice has agreed to transfer the debt, he said. The paperwork will be completed by the end of the month. She looked at him then fully, and what she said was not what she had planned to say, which was nothing, or something composed and civil, and at the correct social distance. What she said was, why? He did not answer at once. He looked at the map volume on the table, and then at the window, and his jaw held that set she was coming to recognize, the particular angle of a man who has decided something, and is in the process of deciding how much of the decision to reveal. My wife died 3 years ago, he said. She had been ill for 2 years before that. In the year before she died, when she could no longer read for herself, I read to her from a book she had been given by her father. It was a book of correspondence from a man named Voss, a second son who had gone to Italy in 1802 and written home about the paintings. She said it was the most honest account of anything she had ever read. He stopped. Margaret did not move. I looked you up because of the ring, he said. I am attending to the debt because your father wrote letters that kept my wife company in the last year of her life, and because his daughter is working as a housemaid to prevent a man named Grice from seizing a property she has never been able to afford to visit. The rain began. It came against the library windows in the precise soft way that English November rain knows how to come, as though it has been waiting just outside all morning and has finally been permitted to arrive. She did not thank him. She understood, in the way one understands things that arrive too large for immediate management, that thanking him would diminish what he had said to a transaction, and she did not want to diminish it. And she was also not yet entirely certain she could speak without something in her voice giving her away. "You will have read the correspondence," she said at last. "Every letter." "Then you know he was not always careful about what he said." "He was never careful about what he said," the Duke said. "It was the making of him as a writer." She thought of her father at his desk in Derbyshire, with his ink-stained fingers and his habit of laughing at his own sentences before they were finished. She thought of her mother reading those letters at the breakfast table, the ring catching the morning light. "I will not take charity," she said. "It is not offered as charity. You will repay the debt from the rents of the property once it is recovered. I have structured it accordingly." She looked at him for a long moment. He met the look without moving. "You have been very thorough," she said. "I have been," he agreed. There was something in his voice that she might in other circumstances have called warmth. In these circumstances, she filed it with everything else she was not yet permitted to examine. He left. She stood in the library with the rain on the windows and her left hand at her side, and thought that she was in considerably more difficulty than she had been 3 days ago, and that the difficulty had nothing to do with the debt on her father's house. She saw what he did for the first time by accident. Lord Carver's ward, a boy of 9 named Thomas who had managed to acquire mud on every visible surface in the space of a single afternoon, had been sent inside with the instruction to find Mrs. Hatch and submit himself to her cleaning. Thomas had instead found his way to the portrait gallery on the 2nd floor, where he sat on the cold floor with his knees pulled up and his face arranged in the specific misery of a child who has been told, for the 3rd time that week, that he is too much. Margaret found him there because she had been sent to close the east windows before the rain came. In she did not wake him, because he was not asleep. She sat on the floor 3 feet away and asked him, very quietly, whether he had eaten. "I had luncheon," he said, in the tone of someone reporting a crime they were forced to commit. "Do you like portraits?" she said. He considered this with the gravity of 9 years old. "That one looks like a mean old woman," he said, pointing at a woman in a very large hat from the previous century. "She does rather," Margaret said. "I think she may have been the one who designed this hallway, so we must give her some credit for the floor." Thomas examined the floor. "It is quite good floor," he said. They sat for a while in the cold gallery, with the rain coming harder at the windows, and she told him about the painting of the Italian harbor at the far end, which her father had described in one of his letters, and Thomas listened with the particular attention of a child whose adults have not remembered to talk to him about things he might find interesting. She did not hear the door at the far end. She became aware, after some minutes, that they were not alone in the gallery, and when she turned, the Duke of Stanhaven was standing 15 feet away with his hands at his sides, watching. He had not made a sound. He was watching the boy, and his face had lost its severity entirely, and what was in it was something she had not seen there before. Something careful and open, and a little wounded. Thomas had not noticed him. Thomas was asking about the harbor, whether the boats were fishing boats or trading boats. And Margaret explained the difference in the rigging, and the Duke stood in the doorway and watched and did not announce himself. And she understood, with the understanding that arrives in the body before it arrives in the mind, that this was a man who had been cut off from something and was watching through a window at what he could not quite reach. She did not let on that she had seen him. She went on talking about the rigging. Thomas went on listening, and she added one more thing to the collection of things she was not yet permitted to examine. Thomas was brought to her that evening by his nursemaid, who was harried and apologetic, and who said that he had refused to go to bed without saying good night to the lady in the gray dress, because the lady in the gray dress had told him about the boats, and no one else had ever told him about the boats. Margaret said good night to Thomas. He pressed her hand with both of his and said very seriously that he hoped she would still be here tomorrow. She said that she expected she would. Honoria Vane had been watching the library. She had also been watching the gallery and the kitchen corridor and the particular pattern of the Duke's morning walks, which had recently begun to take him past the east wing, where the housemaids were most likely to be working. She was not a woman who ignored patterns. She came to the housekeeper on the fourth morning and spoke at length about standards of conduct, about the inappropriate familiarity that certain members of the serving staff seemed to be cultivating with guests, about the uncomfortable position this placed the household in, and about the duty of a properly run establishment to protect its reputation and that of its guests. She was very measured and very kind and very clear, and when she left, the housekeeper sent for Margaret. "Lady Vane has spoken to me," Mrs. Hatch said. She was a woman of 60, with a face that had been arranging itself into neutrality for 30 years and had gotten very good at it. "She has suggested that you are unsuitable for continued service in this household." Margaret stood with her hands at her front in the way she had learned to stand in such conversations. "I have done nothing improper, Mrs. Hatch." "I believe you," Mrs. Hatch said, with a precision that said more than the words. "Nonetheless, Lady Vane is a guest and a titled woman, and Lord Carver values his friendships. I am told to inform you that your service here will conclude at the end of the fortnight, at which point you will be given a character reference and your month's wages." She said this last part with a care that told Margaret the character reference would be good. It was the only mercy available to her, and Mrs. Hatch was a woman who gave what mercy she could within the bounds of what she was permitted. Margaret said, "I understand, Mrs. Hatch." She went back to work. She cleaned the east gallery windows. She carried linen to the upper floor. She ate her supper in the kitchen with the other housemaids and said nothing to any of them. And afterward she went to her narrow room and sat on the edge of the cot and held her left hand in her right and looked at the ring in the candlelight. The debt on the Derbyshire property would be transferred to a new creditor who had structured it with rents in mind, which meant it was a debt that could, in time, be managed. This was not nothing. This was, in the cold, honest reckoning she was capable of at midnight, in a small room, the best material position she had been in for 4 years. She had a character reference from a well-regarded household. She had a property no longer in immediate danger of seizure. She had nothing else. She did not let herself think about the gallery, or the library, or the way he had stood in the gallery doorway watching Thomas with a face stripped of its severity. She was a housemaid with 2 weeks remaining in her position. The distance between her and a duke was not a distance. It was an entire geography. The ring caught the light. She closed her hand around it. There was still this, she thought. The final Saturday of the fortnight was the Carvers' dinner for the neighborhood, a thing of 30 guests and 3 removes, and the particular ceremonial weight of a gathering assembled to see and be seen. Margaret had been assigned to the drawing-room corridor, carrying things between the drawing-room and the servery, visible to no one, and required to notice everyone. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. And she told herself on her 3rd transit of the evening that 2 more days, and it would be over and she could begin the next thing. Honoria Vane arrived for dinner in pale gold silk with her mother's diamonds at her throat, and she moved through the drawing-room with the assurance of a woman who had already decided the shape of her evening. The Duke of Stanhaven was present in the group near the fireplace, speaking with Lord Carver's neighbor, Sir William Petch, about the northern drainage question. He was not watching the door. Honoria noted this and positioned herself where he would need to cross the room to avoid seeing her. He crossed to greet her, as civility required, and she took his arm for the brief transit to the dining room. And at the dining room door she said, in a voice calibrated to carry 2 feet in either direction, "I understand that tiresome maid business is being resolved. You must have found the whole episode quite distasteful." Margaret was 3 feet behind them with a covered dish, and she was looking at the floor, and she heard every word. She had not expected to feel it as sharply as she felt it. She had thought she was past this particular kind of sharp. She was wrong. The tiresome maid business. That was what it had been. A business, an episode, distasteful and resolved. She went back to the kitchen. She completed her duties. She said nothing. Honoria managed the dinner table with skills she brought to all such surfaces, drawing the Duke into conversation when she could, and accepting with perfect grace the moments when she could not. It was not until the final remove, when the table had relaxed into the comfortable disorder of people who have eaten well and intend to stay a little longer than they planned, that she misjudged the moment. The table was talking about the new house that Sir William had finished in the East Meadow and how the Ashbourne Library compared to his own. And then Lord Carver, in the genial way of a man who has had 3 glasses of his own good claret, said something about the library's recent use and glanced, without quite intending to, toward the Duke. Honoria said, very lightly, I am told the library has been thoroughly explored this past fortnight, though perhaps not for the maps. A small silence, the kind that means something has crossed a line that was not clearly marked until it was crossed. The Duke set down his glass. His face had not changed. His voice when he spoke was exactly the same low level it always was. I found the Parliamentary Survey of 1658 in the upper shelves, he said. A useful document. Miss Voss was kind enough to locate it for me. He had not said Margaret, he had said Miss Voss. At the end of the table, Sir William Petch, who was 70 and had been navigating Regency drawing rooms for 50 of those years, looked up from his claret with an attention that had not been present a moment before. Honoria's mother, seated 2 chairs from the Duke, went very still. Lord Carver looked at his guest with the expression of a man who was replaying a conversation and discovering that it contained more information than he had registered on first hearing. Miss Voss, Lord Carver said. Miss Margaret Voss, said the Duke in the same tone. Daughter of Charles Voss, second son of the late Earl. You will recall the family. The earldom failed, but the family did not. Honoria had been smiling for 30 years in difficult situations. She was smiling now. It did not reach far enough. Of course, she said, with perfect pleasant recovery. I had not realized. One doesn't always. No, said Sir William Petch, and his voice was dry as ash. One does not always look. Margaret did not know what had been said at the dinner table. She was in the kitchen corridor when Miss Pertwee, Lord Carver's neighbor's younger sister, came out through the service door with a plate. She had volunteered to return herself in the way that 17-year-olds volunteer for small tasks when they want an excuse to see something. She said in a rush, he told everyone your name. The Duke. At the table, he said Miss Voss very deliberately, and then he said who your father was. And Lady Vane's smile went absolutely rigid. Margaret stood in the corridor with a linen cloth in her hand. Mrs. Hatch is looking for you, Miss Pertwee added, and then, because she was 17 and could not yet manage the entire discipline of indifference, I thought you should know first. Mrs. Hatch was brief. Lord Carver had spoken to her. He had said that he would appreciate it if Miss Voss could be found and asked whether she would do him the honor of joining the guests in the drawing room for the remainder of the evening if she were so inclined. He had said this, Mrs. Hatch reported, in the specific careful tone of a man who is correcting an error and hopes the correction can be accomplished without anyone examining it too closely. She did not have the right dress. She had the gray dress, well made and plain, and she had the ring and she had her hair, which she took down from the cap and pinned back properly in the way she had not permitted herself in 6 months. She did not look like the portrait of a great house's daughter. She looked like what she was, a woman in a plain gray dress with good posture and her mother's ring on her left hand. And she decided that this was going to have to be sufficient. The drawing room was warm and loud and full of the specific after-dinner ease that makes people kind in ways they might not manage before the claret. She stood in the doorway for a moment. The room, she was aware, made a small adjustment in its collective attention when it registered her presence, the particular shift of people who are recalculating what they thought they knew. Lady Honoria Vane, standing with her mother near the window, looked at Margaret with an expression that had been composed very quickly from the available materials. Miss Voss, she said. How unexpected. Lady Vane, Margaret said. She had not seen the Duke. She was aware of this because her body was cataloguing his absence with an attention she could not suppress. She moved toward the far side of the room, where Sir William Petch was standing alone with a glass of port, because Sir William had been kind at dinner in a way she had only just learned about, and she was grateful, and she needed somewhere to stand. Sir William looked at her over his glass with the assessing patience of 70 years. Charles Voss's girl, he said. Not a question. Yes, Sir William. He wrote good letters, the old man said. My wife read them. Half the county read them for a time. He should have published. He looked at her left hand. Your mother's ring. Yes, she was a good woman, he said. You have her eyes. She was saved from having to answer by the shift in the room's social weather that preceded the Duke of Stanhaven's crossing of it. She felt it before she turned, the small reorganization of angles that happened when the room's primary gravity moved, and then she did turn, and he was there. He was crossing the drawing room toward her. Not toward the window where Honoria stood, not toward Lord Carver by the fire, not toward the group of gentlemen near the doorway, toward her. 3 strides and then 2, and the room was watching without quite appearing to watch, which was the drawing room's oldest skill. And he stopped in front of her, and he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "You do not." "I do. I went to your solicitor without your permission, and I addressed a debt that was yours to address. I acted without your knowledge." "You also," she said after a moment, "told a table full of people my name." "I did," he said, "that I do not apologize for." Sir William Petch took a quiet step to the side, the particular movement of a man who has lived long enough to know when he is not needed in a conversation, and they were as alone as 2 people can be in a drawing room full of 30 guests. "Miss Voss," the Duke said. "Margaret," he said her given name with a deliberateness that landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. "I would like to ask you something, and I would like you to understand that I am asking because I mean it. Not because I am obligated by the scene I have just made at dinner, which was admittedly rather theatrical." She held herself very still. Her left hand was at her side. "My ward Thomas has asked for you 3 times today," he said. "He has also, in the course of those 3 requests, informed me that you know the difference between fishing boats and trading boats from the rigging, that you think the woman in the large hat probably designed the floor, and that you are the only persons who has talked to him about anything he wanted to hear in as long as he can remember." He stopped. "He's is not wrong. He is a good boy," she said. "He needs someone who talks to him the way you do." He met her eyes and held them with the same careful attention she had felt in the ballroom, the same attention that had started all of this. "As do I, if you will have me." From across the room, very distinctly, in the carrying silence that had settled over the guests who were not watching, Honoria Vane said something to her mother in a murmur too low to hear. Lady Honoria's mother said clearly, "Hush, Honoria." Margaret looked at the Duke of Stanhaven, at the severity of his face and the patience behind it, and the things she had seen in the gallery doorway that she had not been permitted to examine, and she said, "You are a thorough man." "When it matters," he said. "Miss Voss, I am asking you to marry me. I want no one to be in any doubt about what I am asking." Sir William Petch, at a respectful distance, raised his port glass at no one in particular. Miss Pertwee, who had positioned herself near the doorway, made a sound she quickly converted into a cough. Lord Carver, by the fire, looked at his hands, and then at the ceiling, and then back at his hands with the expression of a man reviewing his recent household management decisions. She looked at the ring on her left hand. The silver had worn smooth at the band from years of wearing, and the crest was tiny and clear in hers. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He offered her his hand in the drawing room, in front of 30 witnesses, and she took it, and the ring caught the candlelight, and the room exhaled. They were married in January, in a church in Derbyshire on a morning when snow came down in slow, thick flakes that settled on the churchyard and muffled the world to a white quiet. Thomas stood at the front of the church in a coat that had been brushed 4 times and shoes he had consented to polish himself, watching the proceedings with the focused gravity of a child who understood that something important was happening and did not intend to miss a detail of it. The Derbyshire house had been cleared of its debt in December, as the Duke's solicitor had confirmed in a letter that arrived while Margaret was still at Ashbourne, learning a different set of hallways and a different set of staircases, and discovering that the library at Stanhaven Park was twice the size of the Ashbourne library and contained on the 3rd shelf of the east alcove a complete set of her father's published letters, bound in green. Sir William Petch sent a wedding gift. It was a small portrait of her mother, which he had found, he said, in his late wife's effects, among other things his wife had treasured. Margaret hung it in the Stanhaven library, above the east alcove, where it caught the morning light from the south window. On the first night of February, after Thomas had been put to bed and had reported, as he now reported each evening, the single most interesting thing he had learned that day, Margaret sat in the library, in the chair that had become her chair, with the fire burning low and the snow still falling past the window, and she read. The Duke sat across from her. He was not reading. He had a letter in his hand that he had been intending to read for 20 minutes, and he had read approximately the first sentence, because the rest of his attention was occupied. She looked up and caught him at it. His face, in the firelight, held nothing more defended than what she had seen in the gallery doorway. That November morning, and she understood that he had been holding that particular undefended look in reserve for quite some time, waiting for the moment when there was finally someone to give it to. She turned back to her book. He turned back to his letter. The fire settled. The snow went on past the window. On her left hand, in the firelight, the silver ring her mother had worn caught the warmth of the room and held it, as it had always held it, through the cold and past the cold, into wherever warmth was permitted to go.